Hey everybody, this is the stuff at the beginning of the book and also the introduction to The Unity of the Capitalist Economy and State, a systematic dialectical exposition of the capitalist system by Geert, I'm not sure how to actually say his first name, Geert Reuten. I believe that's how you say his last name. The chapters of this book are Systematic-dialectical exposition by chapter, Preface, general introduction, Part 1, the capitalist economy, Chapter 1, the capitalist mode of production, the capitalist economy in general, the production of monetary value, and the enterprise's appropriation of surplus value, Chapter 2, accumulation of capital, Chapter 3, finance of enterprises, the macroeconomic pre-validation and validation of production. 4. Market interaction in stratified production, competition, cartel formation, and monopolisation. Chapter 5, business cycle over-accumulation and destruction of capital, business cycles. Part 2 of the book is titled The Capitalist State. Introduction to Part 2, The Capitalist State. 6. State-granted capitalist economic rights, the capitalist state in general. Chapter 7, Furthering the conditions for the accumulation of capital. Chapter 8, State expenditure and its finance, effects on macroeconomic surplus value and on the distribution of income and wealth. Chapter 9, Imposition of competition, a framework of constraints on the modes of market interaction. Chapter 10, The Reach of the Capitalist State. Part 3 is titled The International Capitalist System. And Chapter 11 is titled The International Capitalist System. Part 4 of the book is Summary and Additions. Chapter 12, General Summary and Conclusions. Synopsis of the moments of, quote, the unity of the capitalist economy and state, end quote. Chapter 14 is titled An Outline of Systematic Dialectics, General Appendix, a systematic dialectical method for the investigation and exposition of the capitalist system. And then on the next page it has a chart here that has, it's kind of like a pyramid with an arrows pointing down the sides, with the sides that have an arrow at the bottom pointing down and away. The top of the pyramid says the capitalist system, and below that it says dissociation. On the left side of the chart it says, at the bottom of it, it says economy axis, and it starts from capitalist production at the top of the pyramid on the left side, capitalist production, accumulation of capital, finance of enterprises, market interaction, cyclical over-accumulation. And on the other side, on the right side of this pyramid, starting at the top, we have state-granted economic rights, 7, further accumulation, 8, state expenditure and finance, 9, imposition of competition, 10, reach of capitalist state. And on the bottom of the pyramid, in the center, it says International Capitalist System, Concrete Manifestations. And the little description here says chapters 1 to 5 set out an increasingly concrete exposition of the capitalist economy. First, its conditions of existence, and next, its manifestations. The same applies to chapters 6 to 10 for the capitalist state. The reader may wish to read the book in this order. However, Chapter 6 equally provides the grounds of Chapter 1, as does Chapter 7 for Chapter 2, and so forth. The book has been written in such a way that the reader might also read the book in this zigzag order, 1, 6, 2, 7, and so on. This is further amplified on in the general introduction. The systematic core of the text makes up about half the book. The rest consists of, quote, explications, quote, amplifications, and, quote, addenda of/on the core text. variously serving the less advanced and advanced reader in a field. These can be read according to the reader's requirements or skipped without losing the main thread of the core text. Preface. This book provides a systematic outline of the constellation and functioning of the capitalist system. It is an exposition of the relations, institutions, and processes that are necessary for the continued existence of the capitalist system. That is, the capitalist economy is interconnected with the capitalist state. In its systematic character, the book is inspired by Marx's incomplete synthetic outline of the capitalist system in his book, Capital. Incomplete because that work did not reach the capitalist state. The latter is dealt with in Part 2 of the current book. Part 1 on the capitalist economy is the result of a critical appraisal of current orthodox and heterodox economics and of the systematic problems and gaps of Marx's Capital. The latter especially in hindsight of the development of the contemporary monetary and financial institutions. Without underestimating the merits of analyses of partial components of the capitalist system, such as those regarding the labor market, infrastructure, and monetary policy, the writing of this book derives from the insight that comprehension of the capitalist system is also gained from a full synthetic outline of the system by interconnecting all of its main components. Such a synthetic approach also sheds light on the components that are often obscured by partial analysis. The book is addressed to scholars who share this insight or at least curious about it. More specifically, it is written for scholars and advanced students in the social sciences, political economy, economics, political science, social geography, sociology, and the philosophy of the science. Geert Reuten, June 2018. Now we're at the table of contents for the general introduction. A. Aim and outline of the book. General aim and outline. The starting point of the book. Dissociation. Chapter outlines. B. Intellectual inheritance. C. Systematic dialectics. Methodological introduction. Limitations of mainstream methods. Section 1. Limitations of mainstream methods. Section 2, quote, system, end quote. Section 3, presumptions and prepositions, contrary to assumptions. Section 4, systematic dialectical exposition, 2 reading strategies, the empirical domain of the book. Section 5, systematic order versus historical order. Section 6, immanent critique. D, a note on on mathematics and the readership. E, format of the book and internal references. Appendix, a note on historical dialectics, quote, historical materialism, end quote. Acknowledgements. First section, Section A, aim and outline of the book. Heading, general aim and outline. Much of the conventional research in economics focuses on partial aspects of society, such as its labor market or financial markets, often also an abstraction from the state and its policies. The aim of this book is to systematically identify the interconnections and manifestations of the full range of those economic and political relations, institutions and processes that are necessary for the continued existence of the capitalist system, that is, the capitalist economy together with the capitalist state. In doing so, the reader will be equipped with an outline of the constitution and functioning of the capitalist system. Any science and any scientific project begins with certain presumed facts and questions. I will briefly outline some of my questions. To some extent, this is of limited relevance because the results of scientific investigation often have repercussions and implications that go beyond their initial remit. Within capitalist society, we observe social divisions along the lines of rich, poor, powerful, powerless, employed, unemployed, satisfactory work, unsatisfactory work. These evoke 3 questions. First, why are these divisions apparently enduring characteristics of the capitalist system? Are they conditions for the continued existence of the capitalist system? Second, if so, how do these relate to other conditions that are required for the continued existence of the system? Third, how does the actual institutionalization of these conditions determine the actual functioning of the system such that it reproduces these divisions? In brief, the challenge is to comprehend the capitalist system. Conscious change within and beyond the capitalist system requires its comprehension. In this, I am an ardent pupil of Marx. To answer these questions, we need to investigate the interconnection between a wide range of elements that constitute that system. The method that I adopt in this book, quote, Systematic-dialectics, and quote, see section C, is well suited to the comprehension of complex systems composed of many interdependent constituent parts. Part 1 of the book presents the, quote, capitalist economy, end quote. Part 2, the, quote, capitalist state. Part 3 considers the international constellation of capitalist economies and states. Each of the subsequent chapters of Part 1 has its counterpart in each of the subsequent chapters of Part 2. New heading. The starting point of the book, dissociation. As we will see below, in the methodological section C, the starting point of the book, the first section of Chapter 1, has a special status. It sets out an encompassing concept of the capitalist system, which essentially characterizes its problematic. This is the institutional separation unique to capitalism between households and enterprise, which I will refer to as, quote, dissociation. In itself, this separation is not controversial, and in fact, many mainstream approaches to capitalism start with this separation. The difference here is that I immediately pack into it specifically capitalist property relations. Enterprises claim ownership of much of the earth, and they claim ownership of the means of production other than the earth. The rest of Chapter 1, and indeed the entire book, sets out how this separation is bridged within capitalism and how the ways of bridging it often create new problems that require new solutions. Chapter outlines. As indicated, Part 1, Chapters 1 to 5, is an exposition of the capitalist economy. Chapter 1 starts with the, quote, dissociation, just mentioned, before establishing how trade, in terms of the, quote, monetary value dimension, end quote, constitutes the elementary, quote, bridge of the separation. This engenders the commodification of goods. Along with it, the property of enterprises takes the monetary form of the property of capital. Foremost, however, engenders the capitalist, quote, commodification of labor capacity, end quote. The existence of a generalized labor market distinguishes capitalism from previous modes of production. The subsequent focus of the chapter is on the capitalist production process. Quote, full-fledged capitalism, end quote, is not only predicated on the trade of commodities and labor capacity in terms of the, quote, monetary value dimension, end quote. We will see how the monetary value dimension pervades the activity of production itself, which again distinguishes capitalism from all historically prior modes of production, and how the enlargement of capital via the production of surplus value, or profit, becomes the motivating force of capitalist production. Footnote. There is a distinction between, quote, surplus value and profit that will be neglected in this outline. In brief, the production of surplus value includes the production of any interest equivalent. End footnote. We will see why and how labor is the only source of profit. This thesis is not new. We find it, for example, in Adam Smith's 1776 analysis of the capitalist system. We will also discover why enterprises can nevertheless appropriate these profits, and how capitalist production takes the simultaneously abstract and concrete form of the production of capital by labor. Chapters 2 starts by outlining the logic of the one-dimensional production of profit for the sake of production of capital. Is, quote, more of the same, end quote. This is reached by the continuous investment of profit, and so the continuous accumulation of capital, its corollary being economic growth. There are two main conditions of the generalized accumulation of capital. First, a continuous expansion of profit, and hence an expansion of labor capacity. Second, a continuous expansion of the quantity flow of money. Money is created by banks, and given that this chapter abstracts from a central bank, which is introduced in Chapter 7, money is inevitably created by commercial banks, as is in fact also the case when there is a central bank. We will see how the tuning of the continuous creation of money by banks and of the continuous recreation of labor capacity in the household sphere is essential to the system. By then we will have revealed that money and labor are not only necessary to the accumulation of capital, money and labor are also central vulnerabilities of the capitalist economy. The creation of and markets for money and labor capacity are unlike the production of commodities and enterprises in their markets. Regarding labor, we will see from some, perhaps paradoxically, that continuous accumulation of capital requires continuous unemployment. We will further note that the continuous accumulation of capital is enhanced by the tendency to the incorporation of enterprises. This entails a layered form of the enterprise's ownership and its management. Chapter 3 will demonstrate that an initial financing of enterprises by banks is a necessary condition for the accumulation of capital. Banking finance is a precondition for any other form of finance. Only after the initial financing by banks of the investment and production by enterprises can other financiers take the place of banking finance. Thus, quote, investment must precede, quote, saving. Saving being a, quote, result of investment in the first place. When such savings result, other forms of finance out of these savings may ex post act as substitute for the initial banking finance. Hence, these other forms of finance inevitably, quote, derive from banking finance. This opposes mainstream economic theory, which views the causality as flowing the other way. Savings are seen to lead to investment. This leaves unexplained how and why the quantity flow of money would grow. Finally, Chapter 3 shows how macroeconomic expenditure conditions the validation of production and hence the continuous accumulation of capital. This completes the necessary, quote, economic or economy immanent, quote, conditions of existence, end quote, of the capitalist economy. The following two chapters present its implications and manifestations in the market interaction between enterprises, Chapter 4, and in the cyclical over-accumulation and destruction of capital, Chapter 5. Chapter 4 is an exposition of the main forms of market interaction between enterprises, namely those of competition, cartel formation, oligopolization, and monopolization. The introduction of these phenomena only at this stage of the exposition is indicative of how this book's approach diverges from that of mainstream economics. The latter would usually start with the idea of competition. We will see how the technique of production as well as the degree of technical change and innovation affects the form of market interaction. It will also be shown that for sectors dominated by competitive interaction, much of the dynamic between sectors of production, capital flowing from one sector to another, is predicated on a tendency towards equalization of average rates of profit between sectors. However, it will also be shown that within such sectors, the rates of profit tend to be stratified. Chapter 5, the final chapter of Part 1, outlines the cyclical movement of the accumulation of capital, the business cycle. It will be shown how this results from capital's tendency to over-accumulation, which accompanies a decline in the rate of profit in the upturn. This over-accumulation is redressed in the crisis and downturn by a partial annihilation of the capital accumulated along with layoffs of labor. Through this activity, the rate of profit is restored. The bulk of the misery caused by this recurrent process is heaped upon those expelled into unemployment. However, the same recurrent process of overinvestment and annihilation of productive capacity damages the climate and destroys applied natural resources. The exposition in this chapter synthesizes the earlier exposition, including many of the thorough aspects of the outline above is not touched upon along the way, because actual economic reality is inevitably always in some phase of this cyclical movement, one phase of the business cycle. The exposition in this chapter sets out the concrete mode of existence of the earlier exposition. So far, this book apparently covers much of the material dealt with by mainstream economics, and indeed all of the main economic concepts will be surveyed. However, the book is significantly different in respect of both its contents and methodology. Because of the specific interconnection posited between concepts, the latter will, quote, shift for the reader educated in mainstream economics, giving way to a different view of the science of economics. Until this point, the methodological strategy of the book is to detect to what extent it is possible to present the capitalist economy in abstraction from a, quote, state. While this might appear somewhat strange to social scientists, economists will be aware that this is how most mainstream economic textbooks begin and end. Through chapters 1 to 5, the need to regulate economic institutions and processes is often apparent. In these chapters, this need is often dealt with implicitly or explicitly via modes of self-regulation, thus drawing out the limits of such self-regulation. However, by the end of chapter 5, the need to present the, quote, state is unavoidable. Part 2, chapters 6 to 10, makes explicit what has thus far remained implicit, namely the necessity of a state and the necessity of economic policy for our capitalist economy. Here the aim of the presentation is analogous to the earlier aim, to identify what relations, institutions, and processes are necessary for the continued existence of the capitalist system, only now with regard to the state. The reference is to, quote, the state, end quote, as an institutional continuity rather than to governments that come and go. Footnote: in addition, the term, quote, state is used in reference to a, quote, central state. Some central states result from a union or federation of what I call, quote, subordinate states, end quote, in terms of full jurisdiction. End footnote. Chapter 6 sets out why the capitalist system inevitably requires a capitalist state. Its starting point is again the, quote, dissociation described in Chapter 1, that is, the encompassing concept of the capitalist system, which essentially characterizes its problematic. Whereas Chapters 1 to 3 set out its, quote, economic conditions of existence, we now move on to the politico-juridical conditions of existence. The exposition in Chapter 1 and all of Part 1 was implicitly based on the economic actor's claims of being entitled to act as set out. The core of these are, firstly, the enterprise's claims of entitlement to the private property of much of the earth. Secondly, their claims of entitlement to private property and means of production other than for production by the claimant. Thirdly, their claims of entitlement to employ laborers combined with the appropriation of surplus value, profit produced by that labor. The state as an extraordinary institution grants these claims in the form of legal rights. Because and to the extent that the state grants these rights in particular, it is identified as a, quote, capitalist state, end quote, which constitutes a continuity with the capitalist economy. The state's legal formulation of these granted rights, as well as their maintenance, requires structures of law that are often inherently conflictual in a variety of ways. These are presented in Chapter 6. Chapter 7 sets out how these structures of law require taxation, which inevitably overrides economic actors' property claims. Thus, the state's defense of such claims inevitably requires some degree of neglect of these property claims. This is followed by an outline of the, quote, action radius of the state, end quote, which determines what it can do given the constraint of feasible taxation. The latter is determined by the prevailing rigor of the accumulation of capital. To the extent that this vigor is not sufficient for the state's necessary action radius, it must improve that vigor and thus further the conditions for capital accumulation and economic growth. The main body of this chapter consists of the exposition of these conditions. Regulation of monetary and financial institutions, regulation of the labor market as well as public education, and the state's engagement in infrastructural requirements. This chapter also sets out why social security transfers are inevitable for the legitimation of the capitalist state and hence for the capitalist system. Chapter 8 provides an exposition of the state's activities as presented in Chapters 6 and 7 in terms of the monetary conditions of the state and their finance. Analogous to the exposition in Chapter 3, it is shown how the state's macroeconomic expenditure conditions production and the validation of production, and hence the continuous accumulation of capital. One of the main areas of focus is on the various forms of taxation. Where these are levied, enterprises, capital owners, labor, and their associated tax rates, as well as their effects on the net profits of enterprises and on the distribution of income and wealth more generally. Analogous to the exposition of the first 3 chapters of Part 1, for the economy imminent, quote, conditions of existence, unquote, of capitalist production, Chapter 8 completes the exposition of the state's legislative, regulative, and taxation frameworks that are necessary, quote, conditions for the existence, unquote, of the capitalist economy and for the state itself, and so for the capitalist system. The following 2 chapters present the state's, quote, manifestation in its imposition of competition, Chapter 9, and in its general reach on the capitalist economy, Chapter 10. Chapter 9 presents the state's concrete manifestation in its imposing a framework of constraints on the modes of market interaction of enterprises and banks, and of constraints on the outcomes of such interaction. The first constraint is a general constraint in the form of, quote, competition policy, unquote. The state imposes on enterprises and banks its view about, quote, proper, unquote, competitive interaction. The second constraint regards the competitive constellation that would result in potential generalized price deflation and stagnation, whence the state adopts a monetary policy engendering, quote, creeping inflation, unquote. The third constraint relates to a phenomenon that was only thrown into relief with the emergence of the 2007-2008 financial crisis. That is, entities, especially banks, that have grown, quote, too big to fail, unquote, as a result of which the state is enforced to impose highly conflicting limits to the functioning of such entities. Chapter 10 sets out 3 main manifestations of the reach of the state, implied by the exposition in chapters 6 to 9. First, whereas capital accumulation is necessarily manifested in cyclical movements, see Chapter 5, the degree of state expenditure affects the degree of the amplitude of these cycles. Structurally increased expenditure moderates the amplitudes. Second, it will be shown that the dynamics of the capitalist economy, together with the necessary regulation by the state, Chapter 7, inevitably result in not only an increasing quantity of regulation, but also an increasing complexity of regulation. Thirdly, it will be outlined why increasing social security transfers, increasing as a percentage of GDP, are inevitable. The chapter concludes that even if the 2 main problems of, quote, too big to fail, and, quote, banks and environmental damage could be resolved, again by complex regulation, both the continuously increasing social security transfers and the continuously increasing quantity and complexity of regulation are inevitable and impossible for the capitalist system. Part 3, Chapter 11, presents the international mode of existence of the capitalist system. As with chapters 4 to 5 and 9 to 10, this chapter does not set out the capitalist system's conditions of existence, but rather its manifestations. It focuses on the 2 main forms of international economic relations, namely international trade and the international migration of capital, as manifest in the international migration of production. International trade is not fundamentally different from intranation, regional specialization in trade. However, the effects of international migration of production are potentially far-reaching. When I finished the typescript of this book, the scale of this migration was yet modest. To the extent that this migration is left uninhibited, it evokes the mutually reinforcing combination of a gradual movement towards international convergence of average wage structures on the one hand, and a gradual movement towards internationally similar structures of regulation on the other. The chapters set out a variety of conflicting interests that are associated with these movements. New section. Section B, Intellectual Inheritance. As the book covers a wide range of subjects, it is not feasible to review all of the existing literature on each of those subjects. Instead, references are mainly restricted to tributes and acknowledgments. Therefore, a few words on the intellectual inheritance on which I build are also appropriate. Like most current economists, I was educated in neoclassical theory. Dissatisfied, I became acquainted with Marx's and Marxian political economy of capitalism, and later post-Keynesian and institutionalist theory. Thus, after my initial orthodox background, I became what is now called a heterodox economist, and it is generally heterodox theory that I build on, although that is probably too broad a label. Marx, who lived from 1818 to 1883, and to a lesser extent Hegel, who lived from 1770 to 1831, have been my primary sparring partners, with whom there is a continuous dialogue of ideas. There is a great advantage in having studied one, or for that matter, two great thinkers closely. Often the study of such great thinkers begins with a certain respect for their aims, but once one is able to critically reflect on the theoretical content, different for each, to see each other's limitations and shortcomings, and yet still learn from them, one's relationship to such thinkers matures. Hegel and Marx also produced the chief paradigmatic example of a social scientific systematic dialectic that is the method that is adopted in this book. See section C. Although the systematic dialectical method used here sometimes deviates significantly from that of Hegel and Marx, I nevertheless proceed in their scientific tradition and am greatly indebted to these authors. In this tradition, I am also indebted to some living authors. First of all, Michael Williams, with whom I wrote my first comprehensive systematic dialectical work, Value, Form, and the State, the Tendencies of Accumulation and the Determination of Economics Policy in Capitalist Society, published in 1989. Although the contents of the work often substantively deviates from our joint work, it is unsurprising that the methodology and systematic structure of the two works share much in common. In hindsight, I think that this joint work was a great methodological achievement. As to my knowledge, this was the first comprehensive systematic dialectical work in political economy written since Marx's Capital. Footnote: in 1984, Michael Eldred, who's a big book I have the introduction to on this channel, published a systematic dialectical account of economic competition in the capitalist state. A wider project of his, together with Kleiber, Hanlon, and Roth, unfortunately stagnated after their 1982 to 85 articles on value form theory. Yeah, it seems like what Michael Eldred's into now is like some kind of like Heideggerian stuff. At least that's what I got from the introduction. Anyway, end footnote. In the period since the late 1980s, quite a few authors have written on the method of systematic dialectics. Further, I am also much indebted to the members of the International Symposium on Marxian Theory, the ISMT. Footnote: this group has generally consisted of 8 to 10 members: Christopher Arthur, Martha Campbell, Fred Mosley, Patrick Murray, Geert Reuten, Tony Smith, all 1991 to current, Guglielmo Carcetti, 1991 to 1993, Paul Maddock Jr., 1991 to 2000, Riccardo Bellafiore, 1996 to current, Nicola Taylor, 2001 to 2003, Roberto Finesci, 2004 to current, Andrew Brown, 2006 to current, and Guido Starosta, 2009 to current. Between 1993 and 2015, 9 books have been published following ISMT conferences, with several translations in Chinese, Italian, and Spanish. End footnote. This small group of philosophers and political economists is met for a summer week every year from 1991 to 2014 for a thorough discussion of each other's work on the writings of Marx and developments thereof, with a focus on his method, especially in relation to its variously judged roots in Hegel. The present book has benefited greatly from these discussions. As an inheritance in another sense, I have been helped, particularly in Part 2, by the intellectual and political experience of having served for the Socialist Party in the Senate of the Parliament of the Netherlands from 2007 to 2015. I especially learned and experienced first how the, parenthesis, that, in parenthesis, state's view of the, quote, general interest, end quote, often implicitly is identified with the, quote, unquestionable, end quote, existence of the capitalist system. See Chapter 6. Second, how feasible tax rates are a perennial concern for the doing of the state. See Chapter 7. Third, to what extent the state and the capitalist system tremble when the banking constellation trembles. See Chapters 7 and 9. Fourth, how the state tries to avoid conflict by delegating the most conflicting issues to semi- or quasi-independent institutions of the state. See Chapters 7 to 9. And fifth, why legislation and other regulation inevitably increases in size, and especially why it becomes more complicated and complex. See Chapter 10. Generally, the second part of the book has benefited significantly from debates with 3 different ministers of finance, 3 different secretaries of state for taxation, and spokespersons for finance and economic affairs during those 8 years. New section. Section C. Systematic dialectics. Methodological introduction. Through the experience of teaching the material of this book, I have learned that it is not very instructive to begin with a comprehensive methodological account. Nevertheless, it is helpful for the reader to at least have an outline of the method in mind while absorbing the content of the book. In terms of the methodology, I therefore proceed in 3 stages. First, in this general introduction, I present a number of general notes concerning the method of systematic dialectics. Secondly, details of the method are introduced, as the content requires, at several points throughout the chapters. Thus, I expand on the methodological notion of, quote, tendency when I introduce tendencies for the first time. A general methodological appendix at the end of the book is the third most comprehensive treatment and presents an interconnected outline of systematic dialectics. For most readers, it is probably best to read the appendix last. However, for readers who prefer to have expanded methodological information earlier on, I refer below to sections of the appendix, such as A Section 1, A Section 2, and so on. Although the general introduction outlines the systematic dialectical method, and hence will use some dialectical jargon, in the chapters to come I have tried to reduce such jargon to a minimum. For chapters 1 and 6, however, a somewhat heavier load is unavoidable. A glossary of field-specific terms regarding the method as well as the content is included at the end of the book. Section C, Section 1. Limitations of mainstream methods. The systematic dialectical method that I adopt in this book is appropriate to the theorization of a system or a structured totality. It is an especially adequate scientific method for the synthesis of knowledge about a social system. This is the subject of the following sections. However, one must have good reasons to deviate from the common or established research methods, so it will be useful to first sketch out the limitations of mainstream methods. Much of the mainstream science proudly casts its endeavors in terms of, quote, analysis, whereas systematic dialectics proceeds by way of, quote, synthesis. The following brief description of these terms will suffice for now. Analysis, to scrutinize by way of the division of wholes into their elements, or the deconstruction of initial knowledge. synthesis, to connect, assemble, or unite knowledge, the combination of often diverse concepts into a whole by indicating their interconnections. Current mainstream methods are generally founded on the philosophical tradition of positivism. Their aim is to describe and explain the outward appearance of the institutions of the status quo. Whereas in economics, the professed method is generally an empiricist positivism, the practice is usually a rationalistic positivism, or more precisely an axiomatic positivism, for which axiomatic mathematics is the prototype. Footnote: empiricism understands sensual experience to be the source of knowledge. Rationalism stresses the role of reason in understanding phenomena. Axiomatic positivism is examined further in Reuten 1996, especially pages 40 to 41. End footnote. The modern positivist tradition may be traced back to the early 17th century writings of Francis Bacon and René Descartes. Central to this is the latter's subject-object dualism, or the division between thought and being, quote, cogito ergo sum, end quote. This division gave rise to the two main methodological philosophical frames of rationalism and empiricism. For this object-subject dualism, I also use the modern pair of entity and discourse. These two frames, rationalism and empiricism, stood in a dualist opposition, separation to one another. Phenomena were variously reduced to one or the other pole, reductionism. In mainstream economics, we see this exemplified in axiomatic analytical approaches, as in the models of much of microeconomics, and empirical analytical approaches, as in the models of much of macroeconomics, and especially those applied by national research bureaus and central banks. From my perspective, the first major limitation of these models is that notions of structure and system are alien to them, or simply ignored. Usually these models proceed and expand from partial problems. This is not problematic when the aim is the solution of a partial problem from some specified perspective. Footnote: a simple example of positing a problem as a partial problem can be seen in the reduction of unemployment to characteristics of individuals. Sometimes this might be part of a specific problem, rather than, for example, linking unemployment to the command of one section of society over the means of production vested in enterprises, the incentive structure of that layer, and so on. An endeavor that links problems such as that of unemployment with other problems and with general structures posits, quote, interconnection, quote. Anticipating a point to be introduced later, it may be added that such a common reduction of problems to the characteristics of individuals apparently absolves the researcher of taking into account interconnected structures. Note that I am not arguing that all problems can be cast in terms of interconnected structures. Note that I am not arguing that all problems can be cast in terms of interconnected structures, nor that all problems necessarily should be understood or solved in those terms. End footnote. The difficulty of restricting oneself to partial terrains is, quote, solved by the use of various assumptions, notably ceteris paribus conditions, about the, quote, rest of the world, end quote. Students of these models should know how crucial these assumptions are, casting the problem at hand in terms of caricatures. Think of the stylized, quote, rational behavior, and, quote, approaches in economics, and also how these assumptions often lead to caricatures of the rest of the world. The first limitation is related to two others. The second limitation is that models are in fact complex sets of definitions. See Hausman, 1992. This is indeed useful for analysis, and for tackling partial problems. However, setting out fixed definitions inhibits conceptual development, thus impeding broad scientific development to which conceptual change is central. These two limitations are epistemological in kind. The third limitation concerns the particular road taken by mainstream economics, i.e. neoclassical economics, which tend to cast these models in terms of individual behavior, This is called, quote, methodological individualism, end quote. Rigorous methodological individualists deny the existence of, quote, social structures and, quote, social forces. This leaves references to, quote, market forces, quote, market structures, or indeed the, quote, capitalist system, commonplace terms within orthodox economics, rather unintelligible. For those that do not deny the existence of structures, methodological individualism operates as a self-imposed restriction. It is not at all clear how we can ascend from individual behavior to these structures, at least not in a theoretically informed way. More far-reaching than, quote, methodological individualism, end quote, on its own is its combination with the idea of, quote, ontological individualism, end quote. That is, the idea that in the event that structures are, quote, assumed to exist at all, social structures are seen to be entirely determined by individual behavior instead of the other way around, quote, ontological structuralism, end quote, or instead by some interdependent or dialectical interconnection between individuals and social structures. On the latter, especially see Hollis, 1994, and Reuten, 2003 C, Chapter 10, and footnote. These limitations are not sufficient reasons for not taking mainstream science seriously or to entirely ignore its results. The point is rather that any method is limited by its self-imposed or internal constraints, and those limitations must be clearly understood and kept in mind when looking at the results. The systematic-dialectical method goes quite some way in tackling these problems. Generally, it is possible to incorporate the accomplishments of mainstream methodologies into the dialectical method, but movement in the opposite direction is not so straightforward. Section A, Section 3 sets out how systematic dialectics makes use of mainstream accomplishments. New section. See Section 2, quote, system. So far I have referred to the capitalist, quote, system. Is capitalism actually a system that is a self-reproducing integrated whole consisting of interdependent constituent parts? If we are not content to settle for journalism and history telling, without doubt both meritorious activities, then for science and scientific explanation to be an intelligible activity, it must be presumed that the constellation we study is both systematic and in principle comprehensible. Footnote. In this book, the term, quote, constellation, end quote, has the following meanings: interconnected organizational units and or interconnected processes and or structures, often called configurations. The term may also refer what in ordinary language is called a, quote, subsystem, such as the, quote, banking system, end quote. Most often the term is used when, for methodological and systematic, sometimes stylistic reasons, I want to avoid the term, quote, system. End footnote. Thus some structured totality will be presumed. Quote, systematic dialectics, end quote, refers to the method of a dialectical investigation and exposition of such a system. New section. Section C3. Presumptions and prepositions contrary to assumptions. Systematic dialectics eschews assumptions. However, the exposition in this book adopts the three presumptions. Quote, firstly, a culturally determined language, in our case specifically, quote, English. Along with this goes an episteme. Footnote, Foucault, in The Order of Things, uses the term episteme to refer to the, quote, unconscious and, quote, mental arrangements that underpin the production and the possibility of the production of scientific knowledge over an extended time period. Think of the Middle Ages versus, quote, modernity. An episteme is far more comprehensive and inescapable than Kuhn's notion of paradigm. End footnote. We can, in degree, be conscious of this but no scientific endeavor can escape this broad presumption. It is sometimes believed that mathematics escapes it. However, mathematics requires at least some, quote, initial translations, end quote, from cultural language into mathematics. Secondly, it is presumed that the object of investigation exists, that is, capitalist social formations and especially capitalist economies and states. Empirically, these are exemplified in at least OECD countries. Subsection, quote, empirical domain, end quote. Thirdly, it is presumed that this object of investigation is systematic. See section C, section 2 above. This is indicated a precondition for any scientific study of an object of investigation beyond mere description. Next to these three presumptions, I will adopt, quote, prepositions, end quote, in chapters 1 to 3 and 6 to 8. I adopt these merely because all the constituent elements of a, quote, system cannot be presented at the same time. I use the term, quote, preposition instead of, quote, assumption, so as to indicate that these have a temporary status. In modeling approaches, many, quote, assumptions have a permanent status. Thus, in the course of the dialectical exposition, I will introduce entities that at the stage of their introduction are not fully, quote, grounded, end quote. For example, when I introduce, quote, money in chapter 1, the creation of money by banks, which is only introduced in chapter 2, is preposited. A major difference between systematic dialectical prepositions, the way this is spelled, I should say, is pre-positions. A major difference between systematic dialectical prepositions and the assumption of a standard model building approach is that systematic dialectical prepositions must always be grounded within the exposition. A systematic dialectical exposition is never complete until all determinations relevant for the object realm have been determined endogenously. That is, when no prepositions or assumptions are required and all earlier temporary prepositions have in fact been eliminated. In the main systematic text of this book, I will never use assumptions. In an explication, I may sometimes use an assumption merely to simplify an example. When in a modeling approach some assumption is dropped, earlier statements based on the dropped assumption may no longer hold. This is different for prepositions. All the statements formulated at each level, e.g. at the expositional level of chapters 1 or 2, or claimed to be true, and still held to be true when we have reached chapters 5 or 11. All the foregoing remarks about prepositions concern the object realm we study here. Although capitalism cannot exist in a void, it is hardly opportune to begin this book by offering a dialectical exposition of natural scientific entities, parenthesis, if I could, end parenthesis. Section C4, Systematic Dialectical Exposition. Bracket, A section 10 to A section 14, in bracket. Systematic dialectics examines the constellation of a particular socioeconomic system such as capitalism, not capitalism's historical emergence. See also the appendix on historical dialectics. Systematic dialectics is comparable to other scientific methods insofar as systematic dialectics seeks to reliably know what can be known. However, systematic dialectics differs from most other approaches in systematic dialectics claim that the key to the reliability of such knowledge lies in the interconnection of all relevant knowledge about some object totality. Systematic dialectics is skeptical of any partial knowledge, including model building, although it does not dismiss this knowledge a priori. However, wider perspectives can show the limits of the falsity of partial knowledge. A second major distinction between systematic dialectical exposition and all other approaches is, a second major distinction between systematic dialectics and all other approaches is the method through which the interconnection of the relevant knowledge is gained. Using the metaphor of a pyramid as shown in Figure 1 will help in outlining the method. Goes from, it's like a pyramid here. At the top of the pyramid it says starting point, and at the bottom it says concrete manifestations. So synthetic determination interconnection is what it says on the arrow pointing down, whatever the hell that means. It says closer to the top of the pyramid says conceptual levels. Below that, interconnected conditions of existence of the starting point. At the very bottom, again, it says concrete manifestations. Anyway, moving on. In seeking to grasp a systematic object totality, capitalism, the beginning requires a concept that captures the essence of the entire system. This starting point is denoted in the figure by A, or some Greek-looking A. I'm not sure what that symbol is called. See, quote, commodification for Marx's Capital and, quote, dissociation in the current book. We will see in Chapter 1 that once posited, such an encompassing starting point may seem obvious as it should. However, I know from Marx's intellectual struggles and those of myself that the intellectual process of getting to an appropriate starting point is far from simple. The next layers, denoted by B1 to Bn, set out the interconnected conditions of existence of the starting point. These layers are called, quote, moments. More specifically, beginning with the starting point, a systematic dialectical exposition must pose the proximate conditions of existence of a moment, that is, the immediate requirements necessary for the existence of that moment. To the extent that this grounding moment cannot exist in isolation, that is, to the extent that it is yet non-endogenous, that moment requires new proximate grounding moments. For example, the first necessary moments to bridge, quote, dissociation are money and the commodification of goods, labor capacity, and the production process. Chapter 1. Money is conditioned by the existence of banks. See Chapter 2. Much of the systematic dialectical investigation consists in determining the proximate order of these. In this case, rather than introducing banks immediately after the introduction of money, to, quote, preposit these and to postpone their introduction. Footnote. Readers familiar with Marx's Capital recall that he introduces money in Chapter 1 of the first volume, only systematically dealing with banks in Chapter 22 of the third volume. And footnote. The connection of two or more moments has a synthetic character, and the more we move down the pyramid, the greater the synthesis obtained. Because necessary conditions of existence, and again their necessary conditions of existence, are a leading methodological principle, we in fact get to the exposition of the interconnected totality of the capitalist system. For the same reason, it is essential to abstain from assumptions, because these would open the way for gaps. For this general introduction, I need not say much about the final layer of the pyramid, concrete manifestations. This can be postponed until the relevant chapters. Here I merely mention that manifestations pertain to implications of the previous exposition, culminating in a synthesis of the or several threads of the previous exposition. Along the process of the exposition, from starting point to manifestations, we each time extend our comprehension of the capitalist system. In the end, this will be appropriate to fully comprehend its essential working as appearing in empirical reality. Two reading strategies. Refer to Figure 2. The reader can read the book in its chapter order 1 to 11. In this order is perhaps easiest to digest. However, the text has been written in such a way that the reader might also opt for a zigzag reading, that is, in the chapter order 1, 6, 2, 7, and so on. From the point of view of the method, the exposition in Chapter 1 is proximately grounded in Chapter 6 as much as in Chapter 2, and so forth. New section, the empirical domain of the book. Full-fledged capitalism emerges when not merely trade but also predicated on a labor market. The production process is dominated by the monetary dimension and profit. This started in Britain and France around 1800. When capitalist production is dominant in a country, I typify it as, quote, capitalist. When the context requires it, I use the term, quote, full-fledged capitalist, end quote. In 1961, the then capitalist advanced countries organized loosely in the OECD, Organization for Economic Development and Cooperation. At the time, the OECD had 20 member countries. As of 2016, it has 35. Footnote, 1961, Austria, Belgium, Canada, Denmark, France, Germany, Greece, Iceland, Ireland, Italy, Luxembourg, Netherlands, Norway, Portugal, Spain, Sweden, Switzerland, Turkey, United Kingdom, United States of America. 1964, Japan. Around 1970, Australia, Finland, New Zealand. 1994 to 96, Czech Republic, Hungary, South Korea, Mexico, Poland. 2010, Chile, Estonia, Israel, Slavic Republic, Slovenia. 2016, Latvia. End footnote. When I use the term, quote, capitalist system, I have the institutional, economic, and state structure of these countries in mind, as well as that of all other countries with a similar structure, independently of their level of development in terms of GDP per capita and state expenditure. This then is the empirical domain of this book, i.e. the starting and end point of Figure 2. In various chapters of Part 2, I will refer to the averages of empirical data of a selection of these countries. For Part 1, the outline of the capitalist economy, as if there were no capitalist state, there are no clear empirical data, as a capitalist economy can have no existence without a capitalist state. Footnote. Rigorously, the exposition of Part 1 preposits that of Part 2, whence I could present empirical data in Part 1. I refrain from doing so as this would require continuous elaborations. New section. Systematic order versus historical order. The actual history of humankind is determined the constellation of the current capitalist system through the decline of previous modes of production such as feudalism to its current form. However, the historical emergence and the order thereof of a particular entity, institution, or process might bear no relation to its, quote, systematic importance, end quote. For example, the fact that commodity markets develop before labor markets does not imply that a commodity market is more important than a labor market. In terms of the functioning of the capitalist system, both are absolutely necessary. The fact that forms of commodity money such as gold evolved long before, quote, bank of account money, end quote, does not imply at all that a systematic treatment of money could start with commodity money or even refer to it. The systematic order in this book bears no relation to historical order. History, to be sure, is very important. However, systematic dialectics is no historical science, and for that matter, a historical dialectical approach, such as that of Hegel or Marx, has little to do with their or my systematic dialectics. Footnote. Both Hegel and Marx devised a historical dialectic, that is, for the study of history, as well as a systematic dialectic, that is for the study of one phase, one particular system in history. These dialectics are very different because their historical dialectic is relatively easy to explain. Popular accounts of dialectics most often limit themselves to the historical dialectic and negate the systematic dialectic. Marx, for example, was engaged in a historical dialectic until about the age of 30, in 1848, the year in which the Communist Manifesto was published. For the rest of his life, he was engaged with the systematic dialectic of the capitalist system. For a succinct comparison between historical dialectics and systematic dialectics, see Murray, 2003. End footnote. However, a distinction will be made between transhistorical necessities, universal, and system necessities, general. One transhistorical necessity is, for example, that we need food and shelter in order to survive. While all transhistorical necessities are also system necessities, it is not necessarily the case that all system necessities are also transhistorical necessities. Money, for example, is a necessity for the capitalist system, but money is not a transhistorical necessity. In order to maintain this crucial distinction, when the term, quote, necessity is used, it is always refers to, quote, system necessities, whereas the term, quote, transhistorical necessities, end quote, appears in full. New section. Section C6. Immanent critique. Through the method of systematic dialectics emerges another methodological principle that stems from Marx, that of, quote, immanent critique. Immanent critique, in brief, critique, is distinguished from, quote, external criticism. In brief, criticism. Criticism adopts a normal external criterion, be it ethical, aesthetic, or methodological, to evaluate a society or social productions as artistic and scientific endeavors. The method of critique evaluates society and social productions on the basis of the norms and standards of the object of inquiry itself. Thus, this book aims to present the capitalist system in terms of its own logic, norms, and standards. In this sense, it is presented from within itself. However, this does not imply the absence of any evaluation or assessment. Firstly, presenting the capitalist system in terms of the capitalist system's own norms and standards does not imply that the depiction of those norms and standards and of their results, for example, profit-driven layoffs of workers, must be presented, quote, in rosy colors, end quote. Secondly, when the capitalist system's norms and standards are taken to their internal logical conclusions, we can detect possible inconsistencies and contradictions, as when capitalist business lauds, quote, market competition, end quote, while at the same time seeking to eliminate competitors and to secure a monopoly position. Immanent critique makes such inconsistencies explicit. New section, D. A note on mathematics and the readership. This book is written for scholars and advanced students in the social sciences, political economy, economics, political science, social geography, sociology, and the philosophy of these sciences. In order to be understandable to people of various backgrounds, I have minimized the use of mathematics. Formulas are generally merely used as shorthand, such as a plus b equals c. I also use simple ratios, x equals y divided by z. I have evaded calculus and instead limited the representation of quantitative change to simple notations such as x down, which means increase, and x up, increase, or x prime up, growth of x increases. When I introduce a functional relationship, x depends on y, I start by y arrow sign x. New section, section E. Formatted the book and internal references. Systematic dialectics requires a systematic format. The two main parts of the book set out the two broad, quote, parallel axes of economy and state. These parts are then structured into three levels, which also relate to the distinct conceptual levels or stages, chapters, divisions, and sections. The parts are divided into chapters. All chapters are consecutively numbered 1 through 11. These chapters are further divided into divisions. Divisions are the main structure of the various conceptual levels. In internal cross-references, Chapter 1, Division 1 is abbreviated as 1D1, and so on. Divisions are divided into sections. These are consecutively numbered within each chapter. The sections are the main text, and only sections contain the systematic argument. These texts have been shaded. In internal cross-references, Chapter 1, Section 1 is abbreviated as 1 Section 1. In order to keep the systematic argument of the sections concise, the main section text is usually followed by explanatory or expanding texts that may be read according to need. There are 3 types of the latter. Explications serve to clarify the main section of the diversified readerships. These expand on the systematic argument, most often with minimal jargon and a looser style. Sometimes these will also set out some analysis in the case that revived mainstream views are inappropriate. Sometimes these will also set out some analysis in the case that received mainstream views are inappropriate. Explications may also refer to their later sections and chapters. When required, these explanations also expand on the dialectical method. This should be clear from the brief title of the explication. In principle, explications can be skipped if the main text is sufficiently clear or uncontroversial to the reader. Amplifications. These expand on the main section, though in the form of an aside. The reader can skip these without losing the thread of the systematic argument. Addenda. To go into detail of the argument or locate the argument in the literature. Addenda are for specialists and may be skipped by the non-specialists. Explications. Amplification and addenda are consecutively numbered by section as A, B, C, etc. An internal cross-reference to Chapter 1, Section 1. Explication A will read as 1 Section 1A. The same system applies to amplifications and addenda. In most chapters, the systematic argument of the main sections makes up about 50% of the total text, the other 50% being explications, amplifications, and addenda. New section, Appendix, a note on historical dialectics, quote, historical materialism, end quote. Systematic dialectics is the dialectical method pertaining to the study of a particular socioeconomic system, such as capitalism. This should be clearly distinguished from historical dialectics, whose aim is to comprehend the driving forces of historical development and the transitions between those systems. Thus, whereas a historical dialectic considers the diachronic development between socioeconomic systems, systematic dialectics considers one particular socioeconomic system synchronically. Footnote. Murray's article concisely sets out the distinction between the two dialectics. End footnote. Students are most often introduced to dialectics by way of the historical dialectics of Hegel and Marx. Whatever their merits in this field, a focus on this aspect of their work does not do justice to their main dialectical work. Hegel, having been engaged most of his life with systematic dialectics, delivered toward the end of his life 5 series of lectures on a historical dialectic. He did not publish this material. Rather, his students posthumously published notes from these lectures. Marx, on the other hand, began his scientific work with the development of a historical dialectic, but he published few of those works. Together with Engels, Marx was the originator of a dialectical materialist conception of history, often called, quote, historical materialism, end quote, although the label is not Marx's, and neither is dialectical materialist, by the way. The following is a brief summary. Footnote. Most of the following paragraphs have been taken from Reuten 2003. Analytically and institutionally, any society can be seen as a number of domains, political and legal, cultural, including education, and economic. For Marx, the economic domain takes a central place. Production is central, but has a dialectical interaction with all the other domains. It does not assume a fully deterministic or monocausal role, as is sometimes asserted. Such an interpretation was particularly prevalent in the first half of the 20th century. Footnote: for a critical appraisal from within that period, see Jakubowski, 1936. I guess translated in 1976. And footnote: more precisely, the relationship between the, quote, productive forces, end quote, and the social, quote, relations of production, end quote, play the central role in the development of a society at large. A whole, quote, social formation, end quote, such as a feudal or capitalist society. Footnote: the, quote, productive forces, end quote, are the unity, combination of labor and the means of production as including technology, which in turn includes organizational forms as understood in grand epochal terms. The, quote, relations of production, end quote, are the material relations formed between people in the process of social production, exchange and distribution of material wealth, including relations between the social class that does the actual work and the class that has the power to live off the surplus produced by the former, usually through possession of the means of production that the exploited class works upon. End footnote. That is to say, what happens in the, quote, superstructure, the juridico-political and cultural domains, is largely conditioned by the economic, quote, base. When at a certain stage the relations of production become fetters for the productive forces, an era of social revolution leads to the transformation of society such that the forms of social property relations are reshaped to suit the newly developed, or more accurately, quote, developing, character of the forces of production. This scheme is especially significant for comprehending changes between structures, particularly the dynamics of uneven development. Quote, grand history can be seen in terms of revolutionary transitions, quote, restructuring of social relations into forms that, quote, fit the forces of production more closely. Marx developed these ideas between the ages of 25 and 30, and they can be clearly discerned in the Communist Manifesto of 1848. From that year on, Marx undertook investigations in political economy, culminating in his magnum opus, Capital, which can be seen as a systematic dialectical exposition of the economic base of capitalism. Further, even if there are a few mostly speculative references to transitional elements within capitalism, transition is not the focus of that work. New section, Acknowledgements. Many people have in some form or another contributed to the emergence of this book under the heading, quote, intellectual inheritance, end quote. I already mentioned Michael Williams, my co-author of an earlier systematic dialectical endeavor, the International Symposium for Marxian Theory members, Christopher Arthur, Riccardo Bellafiore, Andrew Brown, Martha Campbell, Guglielmo Carcetti, Roberto Finesci, Paul Maddock Jr., Fred Mosley, Patrick Murray, Guido Starosta, and Nicola Taylor. Among the latter, special thanks go to Riccardo Bellafiore, who introduced me to, quote, monetary circuit theory, end quote, and to Christopher Arthur, Patrick Murray, and Tony Smith, who incessantly sharpened my take on our long-standing shared interest in systematic dialectics in combination with value form theory. I would like to express my further gratitude to the following individuals who commented on various stages on draft chapters of the book: Dirk Damsma, Riccardo Bellafiore, Herman von Gunsteren, Murat Kotan, Peter Williams, Tony Smith, Bo Tio, Jan Toplovsky, Vijand van der Voorde. Included here are also the students of my course in political economy at the University of Amsterdam, on whom I tried out early drafts. All or most of the penultimate version of the book was commented on by Christopher Arthur, Dirk Damsma, Tony Smith, and Bo Tio, for which I am immensely grateful. Tony Smith sent me 30 pages of important comments, and he saved me from a major mistake in the composition of Chapter 11. I have been fortunate enough to engage in many hours of discussion with Bo Tio, who saved me from making a considerable error in my exposition of production in the final part of Chapter 1. I am also grateful for the refereeing committee that I received via the publisher. Without the input and assistance of these people, this book would not be what it is. The above regards the academic content of the book. English not being my native language, I am very grateful to Simon Mussel for polishing my English. For the material production and publication of the book, I thank Danny Hayward, manager of the Historical Materialism book series, as well as the Brill staff members Jennifer Obdam and Debbie DeWitt, the latter especially for a great help in adapting the usual Brill typography to accommodate the special formatting requirements of the book. Finally, I thank the, for me, anonymous production workers of Brill in materializing the book. Okay, so that is the end of the introduction to The Unity of the Capitalist Economy and State, a systematic dialectical exposition of the capitalist system. Thank you so much for listening.